Mr. Mark Selby, how are you, sir?
Very good, Mr. Matthew Gordon.
Glad to hear it. Glad to hear it. I've just been speaking to an Aussie nickel wannabe producer or near-term producer,
Ah,
DFS stage, and Ardea Resources.
oh
Now
yes.
they've been sort of trotting around. The sort of feedback out of Australia seems to be, and certainly according to brokers and bankers, we seem to be bottoming out on nickel price at the moment. How do you feel about that?
No, for sure. I mean, that's as I said, over the last, last six to 9 months, getting a good long-term contrarian, private equity, significant institutional investor who kind of thinks nickel's been oversold, overdone. It's bottomed out here. It's hung in quite nicely, and now's the time to get into that kind of thing. So yeah, as I said, we've talked about our RD before. They've got that joint venture with Mitsubishi and Sumitomo Metal Mining. So, we'll see what happens with their HPAL project. So, good to see them continuing to move forward and hearing a sort of similar sentiment down in Australia. Things
Yeah,
were very negative last year. So,
yeah, and and would add like fully funded DFS, funded by Sumitomo and Mitsubishi. So yeah, it's possible to do ex-China nickel. That's good news. Well, maybe let's talk about remind people where we are with the price range at the moment, and then maybe get into the kind of stainless and NPI metals China news.
sure. So, again, sadly, this is where we are where we've been pretty much since April in a 15 to 15,800 range. Right now, we've been flirting with the bottom end of that range, breaking slightly below it from time to time. But what's interesting is in terms of, and I've talked about this over the last few weeks, is that you should start to see nickel pig iron prices and stainless steel prices, start to move higher as Qingshan's finally taken his chokehold, trying to squeeze out everybody in the industry. And then as well, generally across the metals complex, you're seeing this whole China policy around getting excess capacity, really start to spark some sentiment in the sector. So again, for the fourth or fifth week in a row, we've seen NPI prices and stainless steel prices move higher. LME and Sheffy inventories, again, you read the analyst reports, there's massive surpluses, but yet, again, we're still, inventories only ticked up 1,500 tons a week, and we're sitting, at just over, 1 year's worth of surpluses that these guys have said have occurred over the last 3 years. So, we'll see what happens. But again, what's interesting now is the fact the Chinese tried to talk down ore prices all through the spring and summer, and they didn't fall. And now we're literally, about 60 days away from when the Philippines rainy season really starts to kick into gear, and you lose half of the Philippine ore supply. So that's really setting the stage for what I think, I've talked about before, that, I think we're going to see a very interesting fall with respect to nickel prices.
So just generally in terms of the kind of sentiment across coming out of China, and also I guess the kind of indicators coming out of China. But what should we be looking to?
So I guess a couple pieces. So yeah, so they've been very focused on getting rid of deflationary pressures. They've realized that okay, it's nice to make things cheap, but it's tough for industries to pay workers more when they're not making any money, and so that there's a big overhang on the market that the Chinese government, I think, is now taking seriously in terms of multiple forms of stimulus. But what's interesting is I had the chance during the global financial crisis back in 2008. There was a company that I used to deal with Inco, who was backed by this Chinese billionaire. And at that time, they were panicked about what was happening in the West. We were panicked about whether all the GFC stuff was having an impact on China, and got to meet this guy and 15 of his business leaders for the various businesses he had. But at that dinner, I asked him, I said, what's the one, if I had to look for one indicator to get a sense of what's happening in the Chinese economy, his thing was pretty simple, but it makes a lot of sense. It's just look at the Chinese Composite Index. He said, when it's going higher, that's a pretty good reflection of both market sentiment, and then also what's important in there is in terms of how much liquidity is washing around the system. And so, if you look at that, it's been pretty decent. It's traded sideways for 10 years. You have some false starts from time to time, but literally right now we are at a 10-year high. It's been up over 30% in the past year or so. Again, previous, they had a big peak back in the mid 2000s where we're still not anywhere close to that. But this is a good sign that if sentiment's turning in China, if people are feeling confident about stuff there, then having that sort of global growth engine kind of rev up a little bit, I think is going to again be very supportive to all of the other supportive macro themes we're seeing for metals heading into the next couple of years.
And what's the US doing at the moment?
The US, again, we've talked. The good part is for critical minerals. I mean, the US economy is slowing down. I'm not going to they're going to talk about all the different metrics on that front, but the good thing from a critical minerals perspective, you're seeing more and more dollars flow through. Yesterday, you had that CEO of BHP and Rio Tinto in the White House talking about the Resolution Copper project and trying to get that unstuck from the various lawsuits and so forth that have held that project up. Again, I can't remember the last time that the president of the United States met with a mining company. So, I think, again, if you need one more sign that governments are taking critical minerals seriously and want to do something about it, this should be a pretty clear indicator of where we're headed. Okay,
and say certainly in your case, it's not completely dependent on EV batteries, but they seem to be moving positively in 2025.
Right. Again, global EV sales up 21% for the month, 27% year to date. Again, this time last year, there's all this panic about EV sales, in Europe have collapsed. And I highlighted the fact that it was just a fact that you had some policy changes, which caused demand to get pulled forward and screwed up all the year over year type numbers. They're growing across all the countries, at very, very, very healthy clips. The only market that's a little bit weak is the US. That's just up 2% year over year. Again, I think that's the factor of some of the Biden subsidies starting to kick off. Some of the big ones drop off this fall, so you will see a surge in the US sales into the end of that quarter. And again, I think, sort of a sign overall in terms of the U.S. economy, I'm not doing great. In terms of the amount of nickel that goes into batteries, which is what we ultimately care about, again, up 8% year over year. So, again, general battery demand, if it's lithium and graphite, will be up alongside those kind of car sales numbers. But again, we know a big chunk of cars are made with LFP, but good to see that high single digit growth rates, and again to kind of get to the 5 to 6 million ton of nickel numbers that we need by 2030. These high single digit numbers for the EV market are more than good. So
okay, well, obviously it's the market seems to be picking itself up. We'll see where we get to once we get out of this kind of summer lull that we're in. And before we get into company news, and obviously I must catch you before you dash off overseas here. Where are you heading off to?
Yeah, so there's the federal government is hosting a trade mission for all the Canadian critical minerals companies. So I think it's the largest group to date. We've done this in other jurisdictions, but again, great to see the Canadian government making efforts to support companies over there. So we'll be meeting. We've already got very good relationships with a number of companies over there. For us, it's more a good chance to spend some more time with the key people in the government who are making part of that trip. And again, the summer's been pretty busy with government meetings. I've said many times before, this fall, we saw some announcements on the rare earths. Again, you're going to see more announcements across the entire critical minerals complex. Governments, provincial level, federal level, they're serious about getting critical minerals projects, and you're going to start to see the money flowing. So, I think it's going to be, this will be the real pivot point in terms of critical mineral stories that we've been waiting to happen for, a good 3 or 4 years now. So. Okay.
Well, good luck with that one. Okay. Well, but let's get stuck into company news then proper. So, Homeland Exploration in the news.
Yeah. So this is a renamed Spruce Ridge. We have some common shareholders. So they picked up some nickel laterite properties in Oregon a while ago, and those Oregon is the one place that actually produced a final nickel product. There was a laterite smelter there on the West Coast for about 40 years that was built during during the 1950s Cold War, to make sure that the U.S. had a supply, some supply of nickel that's there. So Oregon's one of the few places. You've got Talon and some of the others in Minnesota and Michigan, but Oregon's really the only other place to do it. And it's laterite, similar to what they're mining in Indonesia, not as high grade, not as extensive, but those deposits are there, and it was great that they've been able to pick that up. And a major milestone, Trump hasn't knocked down all the permitting barriers, and so it sometimes takes a little longer to get some permits. But kudos to that team. They've got the permits to be able to start drilling this material. So a major step forward for them, and a stock to keep an eye on over the next bit.
Okay. What other news have got me? So I saw Lifezone back in the news.
Yeah, so it's good. Kudos to them. They got a $60 million bridge facility from Taurus. So they're one of the the good private equity groups out there, who help companies to get all the way through to production, and they've got a bridge facility to allow them to do what they need to do to continue to advance the Kabanga project. So, good with them and with a good group. The other big news is, we started to see some higher grade intervals from both Talon. Talon had that spectacular intersection that they announced. They announced about 6 weeks ago. This was a 25-meter step out from that. They haven't had the assays back yet from it, but it was, looks like a continuation of some of that mineralization. Again, we'll have to just see how big it is. They published some of the plates, the geophysical plates. They're not huge, but they're there. So, good to see that continue to progress. And then Next Metals, which was the former Premium Nickel, Premium Resources, that's now been rebranded and repositioned now with their Botswana project. It's mostly focused on copper right now, but there is nickel that goes along with it, and some good step outs. I think the new team here is really trying to push the boundaries of the resource and really give a sense of what the size could look like. I think 3% nickel, 3% copper over some good intervals with some decent nickel byproducts. Again, a key question for that deposit is going to be the mineral processing in terms of what they can make from a nickel concentrate, because that was always the challenge with those assets. And then the other high grade, out there was Magna, who are busy infilling some of the deposits they want to start mining in the next bit, and again, some good nickel copper results from the in these types of deposits. There's a couple types of deposits within a Sudbury project. So these were from the higher nickel grade part of it, and so good multi-percent nickel with some good copper, consistent with the kind of stuff you saw mined in Sudbury for many years. And then the last piece of news, First Atlantic Nickel, some more results from their Warite deposit in Newfoundland. Again, decent sized step outs, great intervals, and that the DTR, Davis tube recoverable nickel in the 0.11 to 0.12% nickel grade with, overall nickel grades in the kind of 0.22, 0.24%. Again, these, as you've seen probably by now, people are following any of these deposits. Generally, your standard grade for this type of deposit is 0.2 to 0.3. If there's been some subsequent upgrading of the nickel content, and that generally that upgrading ends up with some fluids that have some sulfur with them as well. That's you generally need that to get higher than that 0.2 to 0.3% range. But again, solid results from First Atlantic.
So a bit of news. The market's moving along nicely. Some of the juniors are still able to put out some news here. General mood at the moment is what?
No, I would say we got our financing done back at the end of June, early July there, and the window is finally cracked open a bit. I think for company, you've seen a number of companies raise money. This is still nowhere near 2011 or 2012 or back in the in the mid 2000s. But people with good projects have been able to raise some amount of capital to keep moving. So we'll keep an eye on that going forward. And again, hopefully this fall, with government funding, coming through, making it very clear that, the good critical minerals projects, they want to see those advance. And then, gold continues to stay up at these levels. We haven't seen it flow all the way down into the, in a big way into the exploration stories. But the longer gold stays north of $3,000 an ounce, that, investors will eventually trickle down, into the earlier stage names, which will, I think, help buoy the entire sector.
Okay, Mark, appreciate your time. I know you've got places to be, so I'll let you go.
Thanks, sir.